Tonight, I want to tell you a story that will change how you think about privacy, control, and the most intimate parts of human life. Picture this. You're lying in bed with your spouse, and before you can even touch them, you have to mentally check a list of over 80 different rules. Not suggestions, not guidelines. Rules that could send your soul to hell if you broke them. This isn't a story about modern relationships or dating apps. This is about real people who lived 800 years ago, when the Catholic Church didn't just control what you did in public, but what you did in the complete privacy of your own bedroom. They created the most detailed, specific, and frankly bizarre list of sexual restrictions in human history. Over 80 situations where even married couples were forbidden from being intimate. Some of these rules will shock you. Others will make you laugh out loud, but all of them reveal something incredible about human nature and the lengths people will go to control others. As we explore these forgotten rules together, you'll discover that the fight for personal freedom isn't new. It's been going on for centuries, one bedroom at a time. So settle in, because tonight we're going back to medieval Europe, where love had to follow a rule book thicker than most Bibles. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why these 80 restrictions tell us more about power, fear, and human desire than any history book ever could. Let me take you back to a time when privacy didn't exist, when your most personal moments were subject to the approval of men who had sworn off such pleasures entirely. The year is 1215, and you're about to discover what it really meant to live under the complete control of the medieval Catholic Church. You have to understand something about medieval Europe that most people today can't even imagine. The church wasn't just a place you went on Sundays. It was the government, the police, the court system, and the moral authority, all rolled into one massive institution. When the church spoke, kings listened. When the church made rules, everyone, from the richest noble to the poorest peasant, had to follow them. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and terrifying. The church didn't stop at controlling what you did in public. They wanted to control what you did in the complete privacy of your own bedroom, with your own spouse behind closed doors. They believed that every single moment of physical intimacy between a husband and wife needed their permission. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if someone today told you that before you could be intimate with your partner, you had to check with a religious authority first. You'd probably laugh in their face. But for medieval couples, this wasn't a joke. This was their reality, enforced through a system so intricate and thorough that it makes modern surveillance look like child's play. The church had created something called penitential books. These weren't Bibles or prayer books. These were literal instruction manuals for priests, filled with hundreds of pages detailing exactly what married couples could and couldn't do in bed. Every priest carried one, every confession booth had one nearby, and every married couple lived in fear of breaking rules they might not even know existed. But why did the church care so much about controlling sexuality? The answer reveals something profound about human psychology and the nature of power itself. You see, the church understood something that modern psychologists are only now beginning to grasp. If you can control someone's most private, most vulnerable moments, you can control everything about them. Sex wasn't just about pleasure or even procreation to the medieval church. It was about power, control, and the fundamental question of who gets to decide how you live your life. By inserting themselves into the bedroom, the church was making a statement. They were saying that no aspect of human experience was beyond their authority. No moment too private for their judgment. This created a psychological prison that was almost impossible to escape. Every time a married couple wanted to be intimate, they had to navigate a maze of rules, restrictions, and potential punishments. They couldn't just follow their natural desires or even their love for each other. They had to constantly ask themselves, is this allowed? Is this the right day? Is this the right time? Is this the right way? The enforcement system was brilliant in its cruelty. It relied on something that every human being has to do eventually: confess their sins. In medieval times, confession wasn't optional. It was required, usually at least once a year. And during these confessions, priests would ask detailed, specific questions about married life. Picture yourself in a medieval confession booth. The priest sits behind a screen, and you're required to tell him everything you've done wrong since your last confession. But here's the terrifying part. You might not even know what you've done wrong. The list of sexual sins was so long, so detailed, and so constantly changing that ordinary people couldn't possibly remember all of them. So the priest would help you remember. He would ask questions like, have you been intimate with your wife on a Sunday, during Lent, while she was menstruating, in the daylight, with too much passion, in the wrong position, after eating too much, during a thunderstorm? The questions could go on for hours. And here's the psychological trap that kept this system working for centuries. If you lied during confession, that was an even bigger sin. But if you told the truth, you faced public humiliation, severe penances, and sometimes even excommunication. You were damned if you did, damned if you didn't. This system created a culture of sexual fear and shame that penetrated every aspect of medieval marriage. Couples couldn't just love each other naturally. They had to love each other according to a set of rules created by men who had never been married, never had children, and never experienced the intimacy they were so eager to regulate. But here's what the church understood about human psychology that was truly genius in its manipulation. They didn't just create random rules. They created rules that were impossible to follow perfectly, ensuring that everyone was always guilty of something. This kept dependence on the church for forgiveness, guidance, and salvation. The rules weren't just about sex. They were about creating a system where normal human behavior was criminalized, where natural desires were transformed into sources of guilt and shame. Every married couple became a potential sinner, every act of love a potential crime. Now that you understand the system, let me tell you about the rules themselves. And trust me, once you hear these, you'll never look at medieval history the same way again. The church had divided sexual restrictions into different categories, and the first category was time-based restrictions. These were rules about when married couples were forbidden from being intimate, and they covered so much of the year that finding a legal time for intimacy became like solving a complex puzzle. Let's start with the weekly restrictions, because these alone will blow your mind. Sunday was completely off limits because it was the Lord's Day. The church reasoned that if you were supposed to be thinking about God, you certainly couldn't be thinking about your spouse. Wednesday was forbidden because that was the day Christ was betrayed by Judas. Friday was forbidden because that was the day Christ was crucified. Saturday was forbidden because you were supposed to be preparing for the Sabbath. Do the math. That's 4 days out of every 7 where intimacy was forbidden. But wait, it gets worse. Thursday was also forbidden during certain seasons of the year. So depending on the time of year, married couples might have only 2 or 3 days per week when intimacy was even theoretically allowed. And we haven't even gotten to the other restrictions yet. The church had identified major feast days when intimacy was forbidden: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, and dozens of other religious holidays. In a culture where religious celebrations happened constantly, this eliminated huge chunks of the calendar. But the most brutal restriction was Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, when Christians were supposed to fast and pray. During these 40 days, married couples were completely forbidden from any physical intimacy. 40 days. That's more than a month where the church required married couples to live like strangers. And just when you thought it couldn't get more restrictive, there was Advent, the 4-week period before Christmas. Another month of enforced celibacy for married couples. Then there were the Ember Days, quarterly fasting periods that occurred 4 times a year. The Rogation Days before Ascension. The list seemed endless. A medieval couple trying to plan intimacy around these restrictions would have found that legitimate opportunities were rare and precious. They couldn't be spontaneous. They couldn't follow their natural desires. They had to live according to a calendar created by people who had never experienced marriage themselves. But the time-based restrictions were just the beginning. The church had also created rules about the biological and physical circumstances that made intimacy forbidden. And these rules reveal something disturbing about how the church viewed women's bodies and natural biological processes. Menstruation was considered unclean, so any intimacy during a woman's period was forbidden. But it didn't stop there. The church required a waiting period after menstruation ended before intimacy could resume. Pregnancy was also grounds for prohibition. The church reasoned that if a woman was already pregnant, intimacy served no procreative purpose and was therefore sinful. After childbirth, there was a 40-day waiting period called churching, during which the new mother was considered unclean and intimacy was forbidden. And if the woman was breastfeeding, which could last for years in medieval times, intimacy was restricted during that entire period. These weren't just suggestions. These were rules that transformed normal biological processes into barriers to marital intimacy. The church had effectively criminalized the natural rhythms of women's bodies, turning pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing into sources of sexual guilt and separation. The church also created rules about illness and physical condition. If either spouse was sick, intimacy was forbidden. If they had eaten too much, intimacy was forbidden. If they had been drinking alcohol, intimacy was forbidden. If they were traveling, intimacy was forbidden. The list of physical circumstances that prohibited intimacy was so long that healthy couples in ideal circumstances were becoming increasingly rare. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging rules were those about emotional and spiritual states. The church didn't just want to control when and where married couples could be intimate. They wanted to control how they felt about it. Intimacy was only allowed if it was for the specific purpose of procreation. Any pleasure, any passion, any emotional connection beyond the mechanical act of reproduction was considered sinful. Couples were expected to approach intimacy with the same emotional detachment they might bring to any other necessary but unpleasant task. If you enjoyed intimacy too much, that was a sin. If you felt too much passion, that was a sin. If you experimented with different positions, that was a sin. The church had created a system where the natural joy and connection that intimacy can bring to a marriage was transformed into a source of guilt and shame. The approved position was missionary only, with the man on top and the woman beneath. Any variation from this was considered unnatural and sinful. The church reasoned that this position was the most conducive to procreation and the least conducive to pleasure. Pleasure, after all, was the enemy of salvation. Couples were also forbidden from being completely naked during intimacy. Partial clothing was required, as if the human body itself was too shameful to be fully revealed, even to one's spouse. This created a psychological barrier between married couples, preventing them from experiencing the complete vulnerability and trust that intimacy can create. The church had even created rules about thoughts and intentions. If you approached intimacy with lustful thoughts, that was a sin. If you thought about anything other than procreation, that was a sin. If you felt desire for your spouse that went beyond the mechanical need to reproduce, that was a sin. Think about the psychological impact of these rules. Every married couple, the church had effectively poisoned the well of marital love, transforming what should have been a source of joy and connection into a minefield of potential sins. But the rules I've described so far were just the mainstream restrictions that applied to everyone. The church had also created dozens of specific, bizarre, and frankly absurd rules that reveal just how deeply they wanted to control every aspect of human sexuality. Some of these rules were based on superstition and folk beliefs that the church had absorbed over centuries. Others were created by individual priests who wanted to add their own personal restrictions to the already overwhelming list. And some were based on theological reasoning that seems so bizarre today that it's hard to believe anyone ever took them seriously. For example, intimacy was forbidden during thunderstorms. The church reasoned that thunderstorms were a sign of God's anger, and it would be inappropriate to engage in earthly pleasures while the Almighty was expressing His displeasure. Medieval couples had to listen to the weather forecast before they could plan their intimate moments. Certain phases of the moon were also forbidden. The church believed that the moon influenced human behavior, and that certain lunar phases made people more susceptible to sinful desires. Full moons, new moons, and various other lunar events created additional restrictions that couples had to navigate. The church had even created rules about animals. If you had seen certain animals during the day, intimacy was forbidden that night. The logic behind this rule is unclear, but it was enforced with the same seriousness as all the other restrictions. Medieval couples had to be careful about what they looked at during the day, lest they accidentally prohibit themselves from intimacy that evening. Certain fabrics were also forbidden. If you were wearing silk or other luxurious materials, intimacy was prohibited. The church reasoned that expensive fabrics encouraged vanity and pride, which were incompatible with the humble attitude required for marital intimacy. Even your clothing choices could affect your ability to be intimate with your spouse. There were rules about specific rooms in the house. Intimacy was forbidden in kitchens because that was where food was prepared. It was forbidden in rooms where religious objects were displayed. It was forbidden in rooms where you could see outside because someone might be watching. The church had effectively made every room in the house a potential source of sin. Market days created additional restrictions in some regions. The church reasoned that the bustle and commerce of market day created a worldly atmosphere that was inappropriate for intimacy. So couples had to time their intimate moments around the local market schedule, as well as all the other restrictions. Some foods were also forbidden before intimacy. Certain spices, certain meats, certain vegetables were believed to inflame passion or create inappropriate desires. Medieval couples had to be careful about what they ate for dinner, lest they accidentally prohibit themselves from intimacy later that evening. The church had even created rules about community prayers. If the local church was conducting certain prayers or ceremonies, intimacy was forbidden throughout the entire community. This meant that couples had to be aware not just of their own spiritual state, but of the spiritual activities of their entire town or village. But perhaps the most bizarre rule of all was the prohibition on intimacy during eclipses. The church believed that eclipses were supernatural events that during a solar or lunar eclipse, all intimacy was forbidden until the celestial event had passed and the world had returned to normal. These weren't just theoretical rules that existed in dusty books. These were actively enforced restrictions that real people had to navigate in their daily lives. Medieval couples lived in constant fear of accidentally breaking a rule they didn't even know existed. The enforcement of these rules was both systematic and terrifying. The church had created a surveillance system that penetrated every aspect of medieval life, turning neighbors into informants and family members into potential accusers. They had manuals that told them exactly what to ask and how to interpret the answers. A skilled priest could extract information about a couple's intimate life with surgical precision. But the church also relied on community surveillance. Neighbors were expected to report suspicious behavior. Family members were expected to inform on each other. Servants were expected to report on their employers. The church had created a system where everyone was watching everyone else, looking for signs of sexual transgression. The punishments for breaking sexual rules were severe and humiliating. Minor violations might result in public penance, where the guilty couple would have to perform humiliating acts in front of their community. More serious violations could result in excommunication, which was essentially a death sentence in medieval society. But perhaps the most effective punishment was psychological. The church had created a system where normal human behavior was criminalized, where natural desires were transformed into sources of guilt and shame. The punishment wasn't just external, it was internal, psychological, and inescapable. Couples who broke sexual rules often faced social ostracism. Their children might be denied certain privileges. Their businesses might be boycotted. Their families might be shunned. The church had created a system where sexual transgression affected every aspect of life. But here's what's truly remarkable about this system. Despite all these restrictions, despite all this surveillance, despite all these punishments, people still found ways to be human. They still fell in love. They still desired each other. They still found ways to express their humanity. despite the inhuman system that surrounded them. Some couples simply ignored the rules and took their chances. Others found some obtained special dispensations from sympathetic priests. Others moved to regions where enforcement was less strict. The Church's attempt to control human sexuality ultimately failed, not because the system was weak, but because human nature is stronger than any system designed to suppress it. Love finds a way. Desire finds a way. Humanity finds a way. But the psychological damage was real and lasting. Generations of people grew up believing that their most natural desires were sinful, that their bodies were shameful, that love itself was dangerous. The Church had created a culture of sexual shame that would persist for centuries. The regional variations in these rules reveal something important about how power actually works in practice. While the Church claimed universal authority, what was punished severely in one region might be ignored in another. This created a strange situation where couples might be perfectly legal in one place and criminal in another, simply for being intimate with their own spouse. The rules weren't just arbitrary. They were inconsistently arbitrary, creating a system where no one could ever be completely sure what was allowed. Some regions added their own local restrictions beyond the official Church rules. Local priests might decide that certain local customs or behaviors were sinful, creating additional layers of prohibition. Other regions might be more lenient, quietly ignoring rules that seemed too harsh or impractical. This inconsistency reveals something important about the nature of oppressive systems. They don't succeed through perfect enforcement. They succeed through uncertainty, through fear, through the constant. When people don't know what's allowed, they tend to restrict themselves more than any external authority could. The Church understood this psychological principle intuitively. By creating rules that were numerous, complex, and inconsistently enforced, they created a system where people policed themselves. Couples didn't need a priest watching over them. Every moment, they had internalized the surveillance system, turning themselves into their own guards. But this system also created opportunities for corruption and abuse. Priests who had power over people's most private moments could use that power for their own purposes. They could demand favors, money, or other considerations in exchange for leniency or special dispensations. The sexual rules became a form of currency in the medieval power economy. Those who could afford to pay for dispensations or special treatment could. The Church's sexual restrictions became another way to maintain and enforce social hierarchy. Wealthy nobles might obtain special dispensations that allowed them to ignore certain rules. Poor peasants had no such options. They had to follow every rule perfectly or face the consequences. The church's sexual restrictions became another tool for maintaining social inequality. This created a system where sexual freedom became a privilege of the wealthy and powerful, while sexual oppression was imposed on the poor and powerless. The church's attempt to create universal sexual morality actually created a system of sexual inequality that reinforced existing social hierarchies. But perhaps the most profound impact of these rules was psychological. They didn't just control behavior, they controlled identity. They controlled how people thought about themselves, their bodies, their desires, and their relationships. The church had created a system where being human was inherently sinful, where natural desires were evidence of moral failure, where love itself was dangerous. This had profound implications for how people understood themselves and their place in the world. Medieval people grew up believing that their bodies were shameful, that their desires were evil, that their most intimate moments were subject to judgment by others. This created a psychological split between the natural self and the moral self that would persist for centuries. The church's sexual rules weren't just about sex. They were about creating a certain kind of person, a certain kind of society, a certain kind of relationship between the individual and authority. They were about creating people who would accept external control over their most private moments. This psychological conditioning had effects that extended far beyond the bedroom. People who accepted external control over their sexual lives were more likely to accept external control over other aspects of their lives. The church's sexual rules were part of a broader system of social control that maintained their power and authority. But here's what's remarkable about human resilience. Despite centuries of this conditioning, despite generations of sexual shame and oppression, people still found ways to love, to desire, to be human. The church's attempt to control human sexuality ultimately failed because human nature is stronger than any system designed to suppress it. The gradual decline of these restrictive sexual rules is a fascinating study in how social change actually happens. It wasn't a sudden revolution or a dramatic transformation. It was a slow, gradual process that took centuries to complete. The Renaissance began to challenge some of these ideas by celebrating human beauty and desire in art and literature. The Protestant Reformation created alternative religious authorities that interpreted sexual morality differently. The scientific revolution began to challenge some of the superstitions and folk beliefs that had been incorporated into church doctrine. But perhaps most importantly, ordinary people simply began to ignore rules that seemed too harsh or impractical. They stopped confessing certain sins. They stopped asking for permission for certain behaviors. They began to create their own moral standards based on their own experience rather than external authority. This gradual resistance wasn't organized or coordinated. It was simply the natural result of people living their lives and making their own decisions about what was right and wrong. The church's sexual rules began to lose their power, not because they were officially abolished, but because people stopped following them. The modern Catholic Church has officially abandoned most of these specific sexual restrictions, though some broader principles remain. The Church no longer teaches that intimacy is forbidden on Wednesdays, or during thunderstorms, or while wearing silk. They no longer require monthly periods of enforced celibacy for married couples. But the psychological legacy of these rules persists in many ways. The idea that sexuality is dangerous, that pleasure is sinful, that external authorities should control private behavior. These ideas continue to influence how people think about sex, love, and relationships. Understanding this history helps us understand why questions of sexual freedom and personal autonomy remain so contentious today. The Church's medieval sexual restrictions weren't just historical curiosities. They were part of a system of social control that has had lasting effects on how we think about privacy, authority, and individual freedom. The story of these 80 restrictions is ultimately a story about human freedom and the various forces that seek to control it. It's a story about the tension between individual desire and social authority, between private life and public morality, between human nature and institutional power. As you lie in bed tonight, in a world where your private life is largely your own, it's worth remembering that this freedom wasn't inevitable. It was earned through centuries of struggle, resistance, and gradual change. The privacy you enjoy, the freedom to love as you choose, the right to make your own decisions about your most intimate moments. These were not given to you. They were won for you by ordinary people who refused to accept external control over their private lives. The Church's 80 sexual restrictions ultimately failed not because they were officially abolished, but because human beings are fundamentally resistant to oppression. Love finds a way. Freedom finds a way. The medieval couples who lived under these restrictions were not passive victims. They were human beings who found ways to love, to desire, to be intimate despite the system that surrounded them. They were the ones who ultimately defeated these restrictions, not through revolution or rebellion, but through the simple act of being human. Their story is our story. Their struggle is our struggle. Their victory is our victory. And their reminder that human nature is stronger than any system designed to suppress it is a lesson that remains relevant today. The Church banned sex in over 80 situations, but they could not ban the human spirit. They could not ban love. They could not ban the fundamental drive toward connection, intimacy, and freedom that makes us human. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. No matter how comprehensive the restrictions, no matter how sophisticated the surveillance, no matter how severe the punishments, human beings will always find ways to be human. Love will always find a way. Freedom will always find a way. The medieval church learned this lesson the hard way, and every authoritarian system since then has learned it as well. Human nature is not programmable. Human desire is not controllable. Human love is not regulatable. The 80 restrictions failed because they were fighting against something more powerful than any institution, more enduring than any system, more fundamental than any ideology. They were fighting against the basic human drive toward love, connection, and freedom. And that drive, as history shows us, is ultimately undefeatable.